This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. We've got a few people on the call. I'm Jen Riley. Welcome to session 2 of our 3-part series on outcomes measurement for the Outcomes Practice and Evidence Network. I am one of the leads at Clear Horizon, a evaluation organisation based here in Melbourne. Would everyone like to say good day in the chat function? Say who you are and where you're from. Chris is already off and rolling from Kids First. Who else is on board? And can you hear me all? Okay, I know you're there. G'day, Matt. Jeff, great to hear you. See you there. Jess from City Stonington. G'day, Jess. Okay, so we've got a few people saying hello. Lisa and Michelle. Great. I do I mute you all just because of the background noise. These things can be so noisy. So, and then sort of I call on you. It's probably a better way to go. But if you've got comments or questions as we go through, I'm keeping an eye on the chat function. And so it's, please feel free to sort of make comments or share resources as we go through today. So we are recording today's session, so you'll be able to access it, and we'll also be sharing the slides. So we will kick off. I'm curious, who was here for the last session? You just let me know whether you were there. You just say yes, yep, you're at the last one. Yep. Who else was here? And I guess those that weren't here, what we will do is I'll do a quick recap, but I really recommend that if you can, get hold of the original recording or slides, because I just think you get so much more out of it. Being able to, because we're building on some of the key concepts. Great. Most people, except for Jess. Okay, we'll see how we go. Wonderful. So let's kick off. So as I said, just takes a few seconds for it to pop up on screen. But basically, last time we covered off how do we measure outcomes. So we talked a lot about, well, what are outcomes versus outputs versus objectives, and how does an outcome fit with a theory of change and short-term, medium-term, long-term outcomes, who has outcomes, what can we expect in terms of short, medium and long-term. And we talked about selecting indicators to measure outcomes. And I briefly touched on targets, but the purpose was really to talk about indicators and measurement. And right at the very end, we talked about sort of data collection methods, but really it was just a couple of slides where we said, we've got more traditional data collection methods, which is sort of focus groups, interviews, observations, using existing data sets. And then the more sort of newer participatory data collection methods, such as most significant change methods or photo voice, getting people to collect their own data. More sort of participatory, as I said. And then the sort of technological, so sort of using the Internet of Things, such as, Fitbits and so on, to collect data. So a whole different ways to collect data so that we can measure indicators and outcomes. Today, we're going to talk more about evaluating outcomes. So to measure something isn't enough, really. It'll tell you how much you've got, and but to make an assessment and say, well, have we improved something? To what extent have we improved something? What's the value of what we're doing? So we're going to talk today a lot about evaluating, and we do that by using evaluation questions. So we're going to talk a bit about that. We're going to consider sort of data collection methods and analysis and synthesis, and talk a bit about reporting. So it's a pretty jam-packed session again. So lots to cover. We'll see how we go. We've got some questions and answers throughout the session to keep you guys awake over lunch. So we'll get into the content. So learning objectives. Hopefully you'll be able to review. We'll review one approach for organising evaluation thinking, so the use of evaluation questions, understand the key steps for evaluating outcomes, and understand what makes an effective report. And then we'll also talk about dashboards, which is a passion of mine, and using technology. So in terms of a question for you, who has experience in evaluating outcomes? So 1 being not really sure what evaluation is, through to 5, it's my job, I'm all over this. Can you go at self-rating yourselves? Awesome. It's my job. Okay, wonderful. Oh, well, we've got a mixed group. Okay, well, we've got people who are sort of putting themselves around a sort of a 2 or 3. We've got a few 4s and 5s. So well, that's really great. So we can pull on a lot of the experience in the group to share. Hopefully, you know, so I'm always, you know, worried about making sure people get something out of it. But I think it's always good to revisit core concepts. And please ask questions if you want to, if you've got them as we go, so you get something out of this. But I'm sure you will. Okay, so in terms of evaluation questions, I think it's one approach. There are many ways, but this is a really useful way. And what is useful is you can map the questions to data collection methods and data results. So you can sort of map it all the way through. So that can be quite useful. And so I quite like this cartoon because, you know, you shouldn't choose the method first. You should start with a question so that it doesn't hold you back, basically. So I quite like that. So don't choose the method first. Focus on what you want to know and what your stakeholders want to know, importantly. Your stakeholders will have questions. Okay, so we use questions. We use what we call key evaluation questions, which is what I'm talking about. We have sub-questions, and we have questions that we ask in an interview or survey. They are different. So why do we use questions? It's a good way to get information, and it's a good way to communicate as well. So I'm going to focus on this key evaluation questions, which are different to the questions we ask in an interview or a survey. They are very, very high level. They guide our thinking. They provide structure for the report, and it prompts an assessment of the degree of value. So what I mean by that, so an evaluation question might be, to what extent have client outcomes been achieved? The to what extent enables us to say, well, to a large extent, to a medium extent, to no extent. It gives us a chance to sort of make an assessment of a degree of value or good. Was it a good outcome? To what degree? So these evaluation questions, often when we do a program, we'll only have sort of 3 or 4 key evaluation questions and lots of sub-questions. But basically, we normally have one around impact. To what extent have we made a difference? We'll have one around effectiveness. To what extent do we use our resources well? We could use one around sustainability. To what extent is this program sustainable? We often look at appropriateness as well. So effectiveness, impact, sustainability, appropriateness. I mean, we may look at the effectiveness of it as well. So they're the 5 domains, I guess, we can ask evaluation questions around, and there are more, but they're the main ones. So the key thing to remember is that a key evaluation question is an umbrella with the main question to research. Research questions is another way of framing it. So how we would frame this up is we would say, well, I've used the example here for young people working on a transition to work program, and the key question there is, to what extent have young people successfully transition to earning or learning? For you, it could be to what extent have parents changed their practices? I mean, feel free to sort of give me an example. What would be an example of a key evaluation question for one of your programs? For those of you that this is your job, this will probably jump off the top of your head. So maybe Chris or Jeff, I'm going to pick on you, or Alyssa or Michelle. Have you got what key, or Jess, what sort of evaluation questions are driving your inquiries or your outcome measurement at the moment? I'll go at typing something in. I put you all on the spot then, didn't I? Anyone willing to share? Oh, gone all quiet. Oh, here we go. Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for not leaving me hanging there. To what extent do parents feel more confident and competent in their parenting? Yeah. So that could be a key evaluation question if that's the focus of your program, or it could be a sub-question as well. You have something really high level about maybe family dynamics or family cohesion or stability or something. But that's a great one, because what you're doing is you're looking at the outcomes in terms of confidence and competencies. So it's about them, it's not about us, it's not about our service delivery. So the sub-question that I've got here for this young people's program is to what extent has the program contributed to young people improving their career knowledge and skills, which is a short to medium term outcome. And the other one there is to what extent have young people created connections with industry mentors, which is a key part of the theory of change. Great. Alyssa and Michelle put one up. To what extent do practitioners feel more confident in working with families and disabilities? Yeah. That would be looking at maybe the efficiency of the program, because your practitioners are an intermediary, because at the end of the day we're looking at outcomes in terms of families. But I think that's a great sub-evaluation question that you'd want to investigate, and again is an outcome in terms of the confidence of your practitioners. Awesome. So this is a sample evaluation plan, and I'll give you some examples of. So here you collect data, and I'll give you some examples of the data. But before I do, I've got a few points. I think what's important is it's important, to collect more than just data about how busy you've been. And we talked a lot about that last time, about the output, 10,000 people through our service, 5,000 incidents of care, which tells us, that we've been very busy, and tells us about our reach as well. But it's important, that we're on track to measure the important things, such as the change in people, or the change in the way our services are operating, and also it should link back to the program logic, theory of change, and your key evaluation questions. And always make sure that the data is lining back up to those things, and you should be on track, because they are the umbrella or the framework for you to collect your information. So some of the examples using our young people one, we said, well, maybe, like an indicator could be the percentage of young people demonstrating the knowledge and skills to successfully transition, or the percentage of people that report having strong relationships with industry mentors. And then we could have a target there, of young people report having it by 2020. Does anyone want to share perhaps an indicator for one of their programs? Just say yes. I might take you off mute so you can talk to it. Who's up for sharing a bit? Chris or Alyssa or Michelle? Jeff? This is when people say, I can't talk, I don't have a, we can't speak through our computer. All right, I'll let you guys off. What was the question again? The question, Chris, I will take you off mute, is what What indicators are you using to collect data on your evaluation questions? I've lost you. I'm trying to find you in the list here. Okay, you're off mute, Chris. Do you want to share with us what sorts of indicators, what sorts of things are you measuring at the moment? I've taken her off mute, but she can't hear anything. You're self-muted. Chris, can you take yourself off mute? There she is. Hello. Like she's better talk now. I can't hear anything. Okay. No, I can't hear you. Not to worry. We'll keep on moving, but it's just going to give everyone a chance to hear a different voice to mine. But you can see perhaps for parenting programs, it could be something such as young parents are demonstrating knowledge and skills, and you may have a tool or a method to collect that, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Or it may be self-reported, or it might be observations by you to show those changes. Okay, Chris has responded. We're using ORS and SRS scales in measuring outcomes in our intake services. What is an ORS and an SRS scale, Chris? It's obviously a validated scale. Anybody else want to share some of the indicators that you're using or tools that you're using? We'll stick with the chat function, I think. Feel free to share. Indicators are always very aligned to your method. And sometimes we go looking for the method or the source, for instance, the particular instrument, because that will tell us the indicator. So for instance, with this SRS scale, that might be your method. So the indicator might be a score of 20 or above, depending on what the sort of scores are. So when I do this, I do it at the same time. Level of secondary consultation, yeah. Great, okay, so there's some examples of existing tools. Fantastic. So in terms of moving right into sort of data collection methods, which we've started to sort of go into, I think a lot of the data collection is done by you and your staff, and I think you've really got to think about what's the best methods, given things such as your time, your budget, your human resources, various biases of the methods, and I think many of you have already got existing tools that you're using. So it might just be a case of sort of fitting it together with your outcome framework and making sure it fits. And is it telling you what you need to know? And if there's a gap, then going and sourcing another tool. But that alignment between your theory of change in terms of short, medium, long-term outcomes, and then lining those outcomes up with your indicators in a matrix or a plan such as what I just showed you is a good way to identify gaps in your data collection. So key steps to designing data collection, what do you really need to know? And I think this is the other thing is you might find you do that mapping activity and find you're collecting data that doesn't align with an outcome. So you've got to ask yourself, do you really need it? Often we have to collect certain data. Like I've worked in the drug and alcohol sector, and we have to complete certain scales because the government requires it. That's sometimes what we've got to do. It's useful to give that information back to the government and say, you're asking us to collect this particular scale. We don't use it in our practice. It's not particularly useful. Can we use something else? Consider how you'll get this information. As I said, most of us, it's what we collect it when we see them. But also, are there ways for other people to collect the data to avoid the bias of a practitioner asking the client for feedback? And sometimes, setting up a sampling process to collect some data from a few people who can represent your larger group, and have a deeper conversation with them. So I think it's about, what do you really need to know, how are you going to get it, and what you will get, and who you'll get information from, are things to just tick off when you're designing and filling out that data collection matrix. To really ensure you've got the best data collection approach for outcomes, I strongly recommend a mixed methods approach. And so rather than one, we're as a sector, we're a bit shocking for just purely relying on surveys. But I actually think your sector does really well case notes and observations. So how are you bringing that data in? Because that's really important data. So often we look at, well, what characteristics do we want in terms of our data collection? Is it breadth and depth? Is it expected versus unexpected? Is it expert review or experience? Is it observation, factual evidence? And so here's examples of combinations. And ideally, your data measurement approach would have a mixed methods approach. You wouldn't be relying on one method. That's also a good way to triangulate data, because the more data you have from different points of view and different approaches and different times, the more robust your data collection is going to be, and the better your evaluation. So any questions on this? Because we're going to keep going with the evaluation plan, but that's really that's sort of what we're saying about methods and ideas of collecting data. People are probably thinking about evaluation, thinking questions. I've had a go at completing this this example that we were working through together, and so what we decided is that our data sources would be, surveys and observation and interviews. So there's a real mix of quant, qual, expected, unexpected characteristics in that. And then you can see the evaluation method is statistical analysis and thematic analysis of those sources. So filling out something like this can really help you identify that you've got a mixture, and that you've got all bases covered and there's nothing missing. But also, if you've got something left over, you could really question why it's there. Any questions? Okay, everyone's either munching their lunch or I've covered that sufficiently at the moment. I've got a couple of slides on sampling, but I really want to talk a lot about the analysis. So I'm going to move through this section rather quickly. I think many of you may have come across this before, but really it's just about if for instance, and the case where we use this the most is contacting clients after the intervention, so 6 months afterwards. We don't want to contact everybody who's been through the program, but we want to reach out to a group to get feedback and evaluate what their experience has been. So we've reached out to a sample that is representative. And so there's some ideas there about the types of sampling. So going with a random sample, we often end up doing convenience in terms of who's available, or making sure its purposes. So in terms of making sure you get a representation of both males and females, or in the case of the drug and alcohol program, you get a mixture of people with different drug of choice. So just in terms of sampling, something to keep an eye on there. And look, in terms of developing tools, many of you have identified the scales that you're using. And I say this to everyone, you generally don't have to start from scratch. ideally use a standardized, validated tool, because if it's, basically if the data collection tool's got a problem with it or it's biased, then it's going to affect your results and the validity of your results and your evaluation of your outcomes. So just a couple of things there to sort of to consider in terms of things to think about. So again, checklists, I think really what we're giving you here is sort of read over it and go, yeah, test it with multiple people, and give yourself some feedback. Good way to test each other's work as well. So that's sort of what we've got in terms of data collection, tool development, sampling, and a tool to help you, or a template for you to fill out to sort of make sure it aligns with your evaluation questions. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about, well, now you've gone and collected all this data. We've still got some more information about closed questions here, sorry. There's some survey questions there. Yes, now we're moving on. Before we move on to the analysis and synthesis, is there any other questions before we keep going on? What is most significant? MSC. Most significant change is MSC. So that's a methodology that we use to ask the question, what's been the most significant change in people's lives? It's a qualitative, open-ended question approach that's useful for finding out unintended consequences. So we use that approach to complement surveys, because often surveys, we're looking for particular answers to particular phenomenon, and we may have missed out a significant change in someone's life. And so we used it overseas because people tell stories naturally across cultures. And, we found out through a microfinance project that it actually had huge implications for education, children's next generation change. And also, it's a way for participants to do the assessment of what's important. So the evaluation, the valuing, the assessment of how good something was, because they will tell you why it was significant. So it's a really powerful methodology. It's worth Googling. Most significant change. There's great resources online. So a couple of comments here. Jeff, any thoughts about direct feedback from vulnerable service users? I think a couple of things that come to mind is really think about how you're going to use the data. As we've talked about, sort of, avoid additional stress of more and more questions, and increasingly people are asked. But I think if the information that you're collecting is given back to them in a way that is useful for them, so I'd like to talk about dashboards later on, where we actually gave the results of our surveys straight back to our clients and said, these are your findings. I think in terms of avoiding bias, Jeff, I mean, using those validated scales that have been tested, they'll be tested for bias. And it is difficult, especially when it's the practitioner collecting that feedback. So where possible, bringing in, having a third party do that removes that bias of, the client wanting to please, or having any other bias. So I think make sure it's really useful. And the other thing that people say is do small amounts often rather than a big omnibus survey at the end of the year, because that can be quite stressful. So Stacey, you've picked up that some of those instruments cost money to use, and there are places where you can see them collated and choose. Is that in reference to the those scales? Yeah. That is a challenge, is the cost of these tools, but monitoring and evaluation doesn't happen for free. There are some free online ones. And I think that a bit like the criteria we did for the indicators, do you remember we looked at appropriateness and validity and timeliness and cost? It is worth considering those. It may be that, you know, you've got what you've got in terms of budget, and you might choose to use some cash, if you've got some, to put onto a particular tool because it's a very good tool. Most of the time you can use them as long as you keep them complete and you don't break them into pieces, because that'll break their validity. So often academics or creators of the tools will request do not cut it into pieces, and also just make sure you reference them. As long as they're not being used for commercial purposes, you're often okay to have a royalty-free license. Okay, all right. Well, we will keep on moving. So, analysis. I love this one. Who's been guilty of collecting information you've never used? Come on, who's been guilty of that? I'm going to put me. We've all done it, normally because we've been told to by, a funder or someone. And I think given we're entering this data age, we're going to have to be more and more considerate about what we collect and make sure we use it if we do collect it. And if we collect it, also try and get multiple uses out of the same data set. We call that value stacking. So, collect once, use often. It does involve some sort of data entry of some kind, but with the changes in technology, things such as being able to record voice and then voice being turned into text using those sorts of tools, and being able to collect data on your phone. It is getting cheaper to collect data, but there is often still some work there, especially around the protocols and looking after data. So data analysis and reporting requires time, and I think the whole process of measuring outcomes does take time and energy, and I think hopefully this is a useful thing that comes out of these 3 sessions, is hopefully something to go back to your management and so on and say, if I'm going to do this work, this is the time we're going to need for our team to do it. So in terms of synthesis, how do you integrate the evidence? How do you make sense of it? Who's involved in making sense of the evidence? Like I said, with most significant change, the stakeholders actually do the sense making because they tell you what's significant. And then, how you organise evidence from various data sources. So one of the things we do is we use an evidence matrix or a results chart, and I'll give you an example of this. And what we like to do, because we're highly participatory in our approach at Clear Horizon, is to take the data back to the stakeholders. So it might be, workers, community, funders in the room, and say, this is the data, what does it mean to us? And bring people into that, rather than somebody sat in a room making judgments about a population group. So here are some of the sub questions. So we had here. I had to go at sort of doing something about improved access for services for clients. So the summary of the results. The program has shown improved management of client access and assessment of client needs, enabling clients to obtain an appropriate response earlier. So that could be a summary of your results. And then what we could have is in your matrix or your results charts, you'd show the evidence to support it. So in a way, you sort of write the evidence up and then you'd write a summary. But that could be a good way. And then often we put these up on the wall. And so we provide a summary, but we're not doing an analysis. We're not making a judgment. We're just saying, this is what's this is what we found. So I'll just give you a second to have a look at that, but I thought I'd try and use an example here about access for clients. That's often one that comes up. So this is one way to put together your results and feed it back to your stakeholders. One way of synthesizing information. So we've had a go at considering the key elements to evaluating outcomes, key evaluation questions, designing data collection methods. We've given you, a template to synthesize, your findings and put a summary forward. But what about judging, which is what evaluating is essentially a judgment of or an assessment of what we mean by a good, something. This has been a good program. There've been good outcomes. From your experience, what are some of the ways to evaluate your results? How have you evaluated as a service or as an organisation your results? Anyone want to put their hand up to provide some thoughts or feedback about how you've done this? I mean, one thing we might do is sort of often we synthesize results into an annual report, but have we gone as far as sort of saying, assessing, we've done a good job or we could do better? Anyone want to pop their hand up and share? Or comment? I've been very shy. Last week you guys were very chatty. Absolutely, we could do. Could you clarify? All right, okay. So Chris, how did you evaluate? Like, how did you make this judgment? Did you look at targets and say, well, did we meet the target? How did you make that assessment? Dakina's saying that she's done some thematic analysis. That'll help you come up with the themes of qualitative data. So if you run a focus group on interview, you'd often do a thematic analysis of the data. But once you've got the summary of the findings, so it could be we run an interview and, the major themes that came up in it were relationships or especially, relationships with parents, and they've improved over time as a result of the program. How would we then evaluate whether or not that was a success? So how do we evaluate success? Okay, so you've done your focus groups, got your targets, you've got your staff interviews. So what's the process for making this judgment about the program? I'll give you an example of one of the methods we use. One thing you can do is you can literally put targets up and you can say, we will, 90% of our children will be ready for school. And then if you get 70% already, you can say, well, we almost made it. If it's 20%, you could say, well, maybe the program wasn't a huge success. You can set these benchmarks and targets and assess yourself against them. That's one way you can do it. But the way that we like to do, I've got another comment here, matching outcomes to objectives. If they're SMART objectives, yes. So if your objective, Alyssa and Michelle have said matching outcomes to objectives. If you've got an objective that's SMART, so it says we will improve this service by end of January, and you get feedback about that, you can line that up and say, well, did we improve the service? And again, use a benchmark. But I'm going to show you a rubric, rubrics. So some of you may have used this, especially those of you who have used scores. We often, when you get a score, it will fit into a rubric. We'll talk more about that. Teachers use rubrics a lot. So it's an alternative way to talk about results and targets. It's another way to evaluate whether or not something was excellent, good, adequate, or not good enough. So it provides an agreed set of criteria to make a judgment against. And I like it because it can provide for a participatory process to agree on what success looks like. So at the beginning of a program or a service, you could bring together all the stakeholders and say, well, what is an excellent outcome? When it turns up, what does really good look like? You know, what does it look like when we've hit the ball out of the park? What does it look like when, you know, we've done an adequate job? And what does it, you know, what does failing look like? And really what that does for evaluators is it enables us to justify the evaluative judgment, because we can say, well, you set the criteria of success and this is where you've landed. I'll keep going with an example because I think that'll help. So this is a really important thing to evaluate: breakfast in bed. So I'll give you an example. So the rubric here is saying you've got, you know, beginning to do well, developing your skill, accomplished, or exemplary. Actually, another rubric that most of us are probably familiar with might be a staff performance rubric, where we sort of say meeting expectations, surpassing expectations. But in this example, we've broken down the rubric by domains, or, you know, such as food. So beginning is, you know, most food is colder or warmer than it should be. It is under-seasoned, over-seasoned, or overcooked. But exemplary might be all food is perfectly cooked and seasoned. Additional condiments are offered. So we've been able to say, well, what does it look like when it's fantastic? What does it look like when it's accomplished? What does it look like? So setting this at the beginning enables us then to sort of assess our outcomes or our data and say, well, where are we on this matrix? For instance, if it was about service or it was about learning a particular skill, so I think we mentioned earlier about parenting having confidence and competencies. You could put things here about care of children versus you know, health. You know, parents' confidence about health, parents' confidence about education, behavior, you know, sort of managing behavior. And then you could sort of say, well, what is beginning, developing, accomplished, or exemplary? And you could work that together with a parent or a group of parents and say, well, what do we think is really good parenting for these things? Or what does it mean to say that we've achieved this? And then you can go ahead and collect data, and then as a group sort of say, well, the summary of the data shows us that we're sitting at a 4 out of 5 or a 3 out of 5. So rubrics is a way to allow us to evaluate our results in a way that's quite transparent and can be quite participatory. Have people used rubrics before? I'm curious from the group if you've used this method in any of your work, and it not particularly in evaluation, but in any other way. Yeah, staff performance is in teaching are quite obvious, and interviews. So this is a useful tool for evaluating your outcomes. As I said, if the outcome is increased confidence or competency of your parents, or increased children's sort of stability or something like that, you know, you can actually articulate, well, what that looks like. Okay, so we're moving on to, you know, we've given you a some data collection tools, a way to summarize it, some advice on analysis and an evaluation. Now we need to put it all together and communicate your findings. So in a word or two, describe what is an effective report. What is a good report? You know, when you read a report and you go, that was a really good report. Why was it good? So yeah, so there's lots of evidence in it. It's clear. Speaks to the reader, so it's useful for the reader. Examples. Awesome. Meaningful data. I think the key word there, Chris, is meaningful, isn't it? So, you know, if you've got information in a report that isn't meaningful or useful, then you kind of wonder why you're reading it. So I think, again, another checklist for you is when you put together a report, make sure it meets your audience need. So if the audience is government or community or your management or your board, it might be a slightly different report. And don't be afraid to sort of use the same data but present it in different ways for the audience, because community might want something short and sharp, whereas government might want something longer, and the board may be interested in particular things, not all of it. So make sure you answer the so what question by weaving data into those evaluation questions. So what does all this mean? Substantiate findings with evidence, which is you know, what I think a few of you have brought up there, Megan. Present information clearly so an intelligent outsider can understand. I think this is really important actually, because so many, sometimes we write these reports and we assume a lot of knowledge, you know, sort of the use of sector language or acronyms. And I think that thing about being clear and concise about, you know, structure sections with signposts. So, you know, often, you know, a report sort of follows that format of, well, what were the questions? What data did we collect? What's a summary of that data? But how do we answer those evaluation questions? And I think evaluation questions, you know, what impact did we make? How effective were we? How sustainable are we? How appropriate were we? You know, you can answer, you can present the data and the evidence to answer those questions. So a few more tips around sort of content of your reports. So I think make it easy for people about how we, you know, and provide recommendations. I think I've covered this before, like, you know, no one report can speak to all the audiences. So sometimes you've got to tailor the content and reports to the needs of those primary audience. And each audience member might have a different evaluation question. You know, the efficient use of resources might be something that's really important to the board, whereas staff and community might be really focused on impact. You know, did it actually make a difference, or what are we learning? Whereas government might just want, you know, the outputs. So you've got to sort of work out who's your audience, what do they need to know, in what format, and when do they need that data. So that's another matrix you can do. So that's who's the audience, what key evaluation question do they have, what format, you know, so is it a one-pager or is it a dashboard, and then when. So just those four things to think about in working out who and what do they need to know. I should have put that in here. Always be clear on the data source. So I think, you know, the method, how it was collected, and being transparent about how it was analysed. And again, coming into this data age, you know, we were talking about this the other day about, you know, big data sets and the algorithms that are being used to crunch data and present it. And we need to know what algorithm was used, and who performed it, what was left in, what was left out, because people are making decisions based on data, and you've got to understand the analysis, and we have a right to know, and so do our clients, about how information is being analysed, which is why we're a big fan of participatory approaches. So in terms of data reporting, I think that's, again, a checklist for you about how you report on your outcomes. And then in terms of sort of presentations, there's some quick skills there about, because we do a lot of this, reporting on outcomes and these sorts of things that we've learned is, the more you can make it visual, the better, because people don't have the time and energy to sit still and read big reports. So if you try and sort of make it really, really easy to grab hold of the information, that's really useful. So we're on the home straight. I'm just going to talk a little bit about data visualization. Got one for you. What's wrong with these graphs? I want to have a crack at the one on the left-hand side. What's wrong with the one on the left-hand side? There's a few things going on with that, actually. No title. Good point, Stacey. That's right. And what about the one on the right-hand side? What's wrong with that? It's missing a title, but what's going on? Yes. Yeah, it'd be hard to understand it relates to this, right? Yeah, no access names. That's right. So I guess it's just, good old 101 data presentation. Make sure make sure they're visible as well and readable. That you've named your access and put some titles. There are some brilliant resources. The best resource that I use a lot is Better Evaluation. It comes out of RMIT here in Melbourne, but it's used globally, and it talks a lot about sort of evaluation approaches and ways of framing and describing and managing evaluations. And outcome measurement being one part of that, of course. So I just wanted to show you some dashboards that we've done. This was with the Children and Youth Area Partnership in the Loddon region, where we put up these. Now these are population level outcomes, so you'll recognise many of them in your sector. So they the data there is presented for the Victorian average and the Loddon average, Loddon being the region. And then a trend line in there as well. So that's population level, and you collect one of these and it will give you, change the region and give you that data. So it's a quick snapshot way to sort of present the population level data. So these were selected by the Children Youth Area Partnership in that region. So they were 7 outcomes on this page, and then the next page had sort of the protective and risk factors that we put on there. So this is a very, very high level, and I think, and here's an example from Geelong where we put data. These are population level ones, but I want to talk to you very quickly about the work that we've done with Windana, where we looked at a program level, which is probably more useful for where you're working. So we started really with a scenario, and we said, well, John is a client at the therapeutic community that they have out in Maryknoll, and he's having his 3-month review. And so Mary asks him to complete a survey using, a tablet, either an iPad or a Surface. That takes 10 minutes. And then Mary opens a dashboard on her computer and shows him instant results. He can see his results from the last session, and then they discuss the results. And many of you might be doing this in terms of using those scales. Many of those scales are available on iPads. But I think, going back to Jeff's point earlier about engaging, highly disadvantaged, the best thing we can do is give data straight back to people and empower them and show them that the data is useful and it's being used. There's nothing worse than giving data that isn't used. People get sick of that. So this is what the dashboard looks like for John, as he could see the admission data, and he could see the results at the start of phase 2. So we were able to have the conversation about, well, what's changing, And really it's the conversation that's the most important thing that comes from this. But these are the program outcomes. So in terms of the theory of change for Windana, they had a series of outcomes around social skills and work attitude and emotional skills and program engagement, leading to responsibility for yourself and others. And as you go through the program, you improve on those things. And then up in the top right-hand corner, the staff wanted to know, there was one question, I'm getting the help I need. And they wanted that pulled out just in case someone said strongly disagree, so that they could respond to that immediately. It wasn't lost in the middle of a survey. So that's how we've used outcomes at an individual level at Windana. But in terms of the CEO was interested more at an aggregate level across multiple programs. And so the scenario there was Anne-Marie is the CEO of Windana, and she wants to see how the organisation's tracking against key outcomes. And so she opens a dashboard on a computer and views the results. Now at Windana, they selected as an organisation 5 key outcomes: improved well-being, increased engagement in paid work education, improved mental health, improved quality of life, and improved access to safe, stable and home environments. So this isn't the real data. We've just given you a copy of the concept because it's internal data. But this shows you how data can be aggregated up at a higher level. So we are seeing outcome data being presented using dashboards so that people can get real-time reports, and also automated reports so that nobody has to sit there in the background and do that first level of synthesis. It's done by the setup of the computer. And if you're interested in that, there's some more information on our website. Basically, that's how the setup works behind, collecting data and then putting it into a system and then aligning it with the organisational goals and outcomes. So a little bit of information there about reporting using sort of digital collection and storage and reporting. So we're coming up to the end of our session. So in terms of what we'll cover next time, really now, it's, well, what do you do now that you've got the report? And then how do we improve and apply learnings? And increasingly, we're starting to hear the language of short loops, feedback loops, sprints, action learning, which many of us have done before. And I think this is really, really important about making the outcomes collection useful, is to see it then applied so that we can improve our work. So is there any comments or questions from today's session in terms of evaluating outcomes, evaluating outcome data? Anything that wasn't clear or you'd like to know more about? Thanks, Stacey. We've covered a lot. Yes, Andrea, we will share the presentation and the recording as well. So I will share this. There's a lot we've covered. But I think the idea is that you can go away and find out a bit more. Is there an easy to access aggregated data program like the Windana one? Well, have a look, Chris, at the Track to Change. It's on our website. You can have a look at it. Where are we accessing it? Good question. I'm giving the recording to Emily at Open, and she is sending it around to you. And I understand that you've all registered with Open, so it'll be shared there. Any questions? I'll put my email in here in case there is anything you want to ask following up and you don't want to ask in a forum. It's my email. Now, so we've got one more session together, as I said, which is next week, and then we'll go into really how you facilitate the learning, which sometimes, you get great outcomes, sometimes we find some sticky stuff, and it's great to be able to hold and facilitate those conversations. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Thank you all. I hope you got something out of it. Okay.